And while we're letting a few members join us, we just want to remind you that almost all of the information we'll be sharing this evening will be posted at this website. And this website will continue to be updated over the next several weeks and throughout the planning process. So please continue to visit this site for more information and for any additional information that we may be able to post after tonight's session regarding some of the questions that may come up. And again, if you're just now joining us, you may not realize that there's a Q&A feature as part of Google Meet, and that's what we'll be using to capture your questions tonight. So if you'll look for this grid shape or icon on the lower portion of your toolbar, that's if you're using a desktop or a laptop. If you're on a mobile device, we would encourage you to look for the three dots. And you're going to look for three shapes. Ultimately, what you're looking for is this question mark icon, and that will get you to the Q&A feature. We will capture all of your questions throughout the session. Please post them throughout the session. Don't worry about waiting until the end. Go ahead and post them now if you already have questions. If you'll notice that your question has been removed from the Q&A, that lets you know that we have successfully captured that question, and we'll address it later in today's session. Again, we are trying to make sure that your questions are able to be posted anonymously, and so that's why we're using this method tonight. Glenn, I'll turn things back over to you.
Thank you, Susan. So tonight we'll go through some information that staff uses to address long-term crowding concerns, particularly speaking about Oakview Elementary. We're going to start from the beginning of the process, since many of you may not have been plugged in when we first started presenting information to the board back in probably about January, February. But what we'll do is we'll walk you through all the information, and then at the end, like Susan said, we'll share some questions, and I'll answer as many as possible. Any questions that we can't answer on the spot, we will produce an FAQ for families, and we'll place it on the website that we had shared. So there's a 6-step process that we follow when we're looking at our planning. Step 1 is the annual forecast. Step 2, projected crowding. Step 3, we'll review the capital improvement plan, or the CIP. Step 4 is the annual enrollment plan, or better known as the student assignment plan. Step 5, we review CAP schools, which many of you are aware of because Oakview is a CAP school. And then step 6, which is where it brings us tonight, where we're addressing other school utilization concerns. And we'll talk more about that. As you can see, it's highlighted, and the dates that were set there were March and April of 2025. This process started when we brought a presentation to the board in June 3rd to talk about Lake Myra Elementary and converting it from a single track 4 to a multi-track year-round calendar. And at that point, the board had asked staff to explore other areas to expedite calendar conversions in order to deal with the long-term growth or lack thereof in certain areas, so that we can better utilize all of our facilities. And so what we did was we started to make a presentation on June 10th to the board, and we looked at several schools, and I asked that many of you go to that website and review the June 10th presentation, because it'll outline a lot of the schools and how we came to bring them to this initial discussion that we're having today. So step 1 in the forecast process is staff at Wake County Schools works with our municipal partners, and they collect information on what residential growth is coming to those particular areas throughout the county. We then use that data to work with a third-party vendor to determine where our growth will be over the next 10 years.
Glenn, I want to address a question that's come in because it's timely. Some people are saying that they're getting messages from friends or neighbors or coworkers that they can't get into the meeting. We did have a period where too many were trying to join all at the same time. That has resolved itself. So if you have anybody who's not been able to log in, please encourage them to go ahead and keep trying. We'll get them in. We have not hit a space limit. In addition, if there's any other reason why someone couldn't join us tonight, as we mentioned earlier, the session is being recorded.
Thank you, Susan. So here we have a map that shows what our forecast looks like. So the map on the left was last year's forecast, and it's, again, a 10-year forecast that was from 2024 to 2033. And I wanted to show a comparison to this year's forecast on the right-hand side. The way to understand this map, the blue arrows show us where we're having projected growth over the next 10 years. Okay, the larger the arrow, the more students are expected to move into that particular area. The red arrows show we're expecting to see a decrease in the current enrollment. So after we go through that forecast process, then we we look at our application windows. So we have our magnet and year-round application windows. You'll see student movement throughout the district. And then we use that information to then project what our next year capacities and enrollments will be, how we'll be utilizing our schools. And that utilization planning helps drive a lot of our next steps that we'll talk about. So that utilization here is put together in a map. The projected crowding for elementary schools is in the map on the top left, middle school in the bottom middle, and high school on the top right. And to understand these maps, the red areas represent areas where we have extreme crowding. Those are areas where the school utilization is over 110% crowding. The areas in orange are overcrowded schools where they're expected to be 100 to 110% crowded. Yellow, which is 90 to 100% crowding, is kind of our sweet spot. Our goal is to have all schools at 95%. And the reason for that is because if you have a incoming class that is larger than expected, you have the additional classroom space to deal with that bubble as it comes through. Because students don't come in nice, neat packages and always come in 90 students per grade. And then your areas in white are schools that are underutilized. And so these are areas where we have enrollment is much lower than the amount of seats that students can occupy the school. And so we often look at areas where, do we have multi-track year-round schools in those particular areas? Do we still need to operate multi-track? Or we look at, do we have additional crowding concerns at neighboring schools that we can assist with reassigning students to offset some of that crowding? And then the capital improvement plan, which is our 7-year plan, it's also known as the CIP. There's a two-pronged approach here. Part of the capital improvement plan deals with building new schools. So again, the forecast helps us and the projected crowding helps us determine where do we need a new school, because the growth is going to outpace the seats that we have in a particular area. And so here you'll see all the schools that are circled are schools that are currently in our 7-year plan. And this is just a chart form that shows all of that information. You can see in 25-26, we'll be opening 4 new schools: Bowling Road Elementary, Pleasant Plains Elementary, Rex Road Elementary, and Felton Grove High School. We actually have a 5th school that's been built, Hilltop Needmore Elementary, but it's serving as a swing space while Fuquay Elementary gets a renovation. They'll open for their own student population during the 26-27 school year. You can see Morrisville High School will open up in the 27-28 school year. Parkside Middle School and Wake Early College of Information and Biotechnology, their 9th and 10th grade center, will be open for business in 29-30. And then in 2030, you have Pool Road Elementary and then Marshburn Road Elementary in 2030. And again, you can see it serving as a swing space for Wendell Elementary for their much needed renovation. So the other part of the capital improvement plan are renovations. And renovations are appropriate for schools that maybe their life cycle has passed, and so now we need to refurbish the buildings or completely tear down and rebuild. It could be opportunities for us to expand the capacity at the school so that we can fit more students there so we don't have to reassign or don't have to build new schools. So we use that in tandem with the information we had from the previous slides. And again, here's a chart to show when each of those renovations plan to be completed. So then the next step is the annual enrollment plan or the student assignment plan that many of you know. And so when we go through and we determine where do we need new schools, where do we have renovations coming, we then use the annual enrollment plan to fill those new schools, to create new base attendance areas. We may use it to offset some overcrowded schools in particular areas or underutilized schools in particular areas to help balance the enrollment. And then we look at CAP schools. CAP schools are schools that the base attendance area has too many students in it and all of the students are not able to all attend the school at the same time. Capping is a concern of the board because it requires transportation to overflow schools. So when students get capped out of a base school, they are sent to a proximate overflow school with district transportation. that transportation is inefficient and often puts a strain on our transportation department. And during a national bus driver shortage, it continues to put more pressure than needed. So the board has asked staff to continue to look at ways to reduce the number of CAP schools around the district. So that leaves us with our last step and where we are today. So again, I showed you that we reviewed CAP schools, and then step 2 is we identify schools that are not operating on a multi-track year-round calendar, but still have long-term crowding concerns. And that's why we're here today. So here I wanted to take a moment to highlight this particular area. So this is the crowding map for 25-26 that I had shared previously, and I just highlighted the area for Oakview Elementary. So you can see I put it a black dot in that particular area to give you an idea. So here you can see there are overcrowded schools nearby. There are underutilized schools nearby. And many of the underutilized schools nearby had been impacted by the recent opening of new schools. You can see Pleasant Plains Elementary, which is projected to open at 61% crowded on a multi-track year-round calendar. Rex Road is projected to open up at 54% crowded on a multi-track year-round calendar. And previously, Woods Creek Elementary opened up, and they're currently at 55% crowded. So many of you may ask, well, why didn't you just add more students to those schools, and then you'd fill them up, and then we wouldn't have to have this conversation today? And that's a great question. But staff has heard feedback from parents and from board members over the years that they're not in favor of multiple reassignments in a short period of time. We could have easily filled those schools with students from the Oakview base, but then shortly thereafter, once their base attendance areas continue to grow, because as you can see on the map with the arrows, this particular area, the southwest part of the county, is continuing to grow over the next 10 years. So therefore, we would need to move students in a short period of time, and that's just not something we want to continue to do. So here you can see the map on the right. I put a circle around the Oakview attendance area. You can still see that there is projected growth in this particular area. So we've utilized multiple levers in dealing with long-term crowding. The school is already capped. We've opened new schools in the area, and it still hasn't impacted Oakview enough. And we've utilized other base attendance area changes. So we've made reassignments in this particular area and in neighboring schools to try to reduce the crowding, and it's still not enough. So here, just looking ahead, what do we have as with regards to new schools coming that could provide relief? And we just don't have anything within the next 7 years. So therefore, we need to look at other alternatives. So that's how staff came to the recommendation that we were asking the board to consider converting Oakview Elementary to a multi-track year-round calendar for the 27-28 school year. And the reason why it's so far out is because staff and the board want to give, and when I say staff, I say Office of School Choice staff, want to give families and school staff at Oakview plenty of time to adjust to the decision if it's made. And so that would give families time to make other arrangements for their care, take a look at what multi-track year-round care options they have in the particular area, adjust calendars for maybe sibling alignment, all of those things. Giving a 2-year window provides enough time for families to make those choices. Because Oakview is currently operating on the traditional calendar, it's had an enrollment cap since 2019. And the recent new construction, as I shared in the area, was unable to address the long-term crowding for Oakview Elementary.
All right, just a quick reminder for those of you that may have joined us after we shared this information. If you do have questions either about this presentation or that you kind of had top of mind as you were coming into the session, please use the Q&A feature to post those questions. If you're on a computer or a laptop, you're looking for that grid icon on the lower portion of your screen. If you're using a mobile device, you're looking for the 3 dots. And then ultimately, you're trying to find that question mark icon, and that'll lead you to the Q&A feature. Just a friendly reminder, we are making sure that your questions are able to be posted anonymously. So once that you see that your question has been removed from the Q&A, that lets you know that it has been successfully captured by one of our moderators, and we will address it towards the end of this session.
Thank you, Susan. So here, the thought exchange, which we've opened up since July 1st, I did a snapshot of the information we've collected as of July 25th. And as Susan shared earlier, we'll keep this open until September 5th. So please continue to provide feedback and rate thoughts that are up on the site. So just to give you a quick recap, as of July 25th, there were 225 participants, which generated 261 thoughts. There were 4,246 ratings of those thoughts, which averaged about 16 ratings per thought. And the alignment was low, meaning that if people were either for or against a particular calendar change, there wasn't much alignment between those thoughts.
And Glenn, just a friendly reminder, this is a combined total of both the staff and community thought exchanges. So if you're looking at an individual thought exchange based on your role, you might see a slightly reduced number because it's taking both of those numbers and adding them together.
Thank you, Susan, for sharing that. And also, I want to remind people that when we present to the board, we will be presenting the information in two separate ways. We'll be presenting the staff information and the parent guardian information separately. So to just give a quick summary of both of the sessions, many advocate for retaining the traditional calendar to preserve family cohesion, teacher retention, and student-teacher relationships, particularly for those in special ed and advanced programs. There were concerns that included misaligned schedules for nearby schools, childcare challenges, and the burden of shifting from established routines. Those who were in support of year-round cite the benefits of reduced summer learning loss and improving student retention. But overall, the community largely opposes the change, prioritizing familiar continuity over perceived logistical benefits of year-round schooling. So here were some of the themes that have come out of the thoughts, and the star score shows what the average rating was for each of those particular themes. I'll just talk about the top three. So the top three themes that are coming out of the thoughts that have been shared and scored are family scheduling conflict, sibling scheduling misalignment, and staff and community stability. And I tried to capture some of the thoughts so that I can share them with you tonight. I took the top three staff thoughts and then the top three parent thoughts, and I've got them on the left-hand side. And then I also generalized the other highly rated comments that we're seeing. A lot of it deals with, we do not support this particular change. We like the stability that we have with our current calendar, concerns over teacher turnover, keeping siblings on the same calendar. There were also feelings that new families should be impacted instead of existing ones. And these are all thoughts that have been shared and rated, and we'll continue to share that with the board we're expecting a September 16th meeting.
And for those of you that might find this difficult to read, the entire thought exchange is available for you to peruse when you look at it. So you can sort and filter and look at comments on your own. And once the thought exchange has closed, an interactive web version of the report will become available. So you'll be able to read these with much greater ease.
Thank you, Susan.
Oh, my turn again. Just one more time, if you've got questions that are coming up, please feel free to post those to the Q&A feature here. That is the way to get questions to us. That's how we'll take your live questions. And we will keep this feature open throughout the call. So once we get to the question and answer period, we start answering questions. If you have additional or follow-up questions, you can keep posting those questions, and our moderators will keep monitoring the queue. Y si necesita ayuda en español, por favor, envíe un correo electrónico a studentassignment@wcpss.net y alguien se comunicará con usted mañana. And so, Glenn, and just to give you a little time to take a drink of water, I know you shared quite a bit of information. Again, thank you so much for spending your time with us. And we still have well over an hour left of our session time, Glenn. So I think we should be able to get to the bulk of the questions. So we'll go ahead and start with the questions that have already been posted. And then those of you that have additional questions, please continue to post those. We'll start with a really just technical question. Someone was asking, when making this decision, is there any way that the currently enrolled students could sort of graduate before transitioning to the calendar change?
So I'm not sure how we would logistically be able to do that, because if we were, that means we would have to wait to make the calendar change until the current kindergarten class has exited the school. But it seems like that it would continue to affect other grades after, because we can't stop filling the school. We definitely have crowding concerns. Am I missing that?
Maybe if I ask it differently, is
Okay.
there a possibility to operate two different calendars at the school at the same time? So maybe the current fourth graders could finish fifth grade on traditional, and then I'm not quite sure what the intent was, but I want to ask it in those two different ways.
I'm glad you asked it that way, because that's not something we've really looked at considering. But that's something that we may be able to look at and evaluate. Our goal is to try to be as least impactful as possible, right? And while I understand that making a calendar change is completely disruptive to both staff and parents and students, unfortunately, we're at this point in time where we just don't have the funds to continue to build new schools, particularly in this area, when we also have areas like Wendell and Zebulon that are experiencing extremely high growth. And we have a large number of schools that are behind on their renovations, and so we need to get them renovated. So with a limited amount of money, we're trying to find ways to efficiently use all of our space. But that is something we could consider and look at if that's really what the recommendation is.
Okay. A different question, but in the same sort of area about proposed changes and the process. Sort of questions, and we've got multiple that say this slightly differently, so I'm going to try to sort of capture them all in a single question, and of course we can ask it again if we didn't quite hit the mark. But there's a lot of families that feel like we moved here and picked this address or this house because it was in a traditional base attendance area, and feel that there's plenty of other year-round options in the community and in this, surrounding areas. Why is this considered a good idea to change the calendar of this particular school, knowing that many families purchase their homes knowing that the school would be traditional?
It's a great comment. And I'll expand that to be impacting staff as well, because staff pick a school to work at based on a calendar as well. And so that's part of the difficult decision that we're bringing to everyone today. This isn't something we just thought of yesterday. This is something we've been tracking for several years. I think the current financial climate has expedited some of this movement. But ultimately, the board really just continues to ask us to be efficient. And so with the lack of funding to be able to build new schools, I just don't see too many other alternatives where we can avoid addressing the crowding concerns. We don't have the ability to stop the growth that comes, because that's our municipal partners. They handle the new residential growth in the particular areas. To spin it as a positive, being overcrowded and being in a high growth area is good. It means we're doing something right. And I think the genesis of trying to change the calendar, not only for the purposes of not building new schools, but it's also to try to provide stability for families so that we don't have to reassign as many families. We know that people go to a particular school and like it there. And so we're trying our best to make sure that they can stay. I think that was part of it as well, but it's never going to be a perfect process. But I do understand that people pick and choose things based on the information they have at that time. And that's a tough part of this process.
Since you mentioned staff, we have had several questions about, is the district at all concerned about, or has the district developed a plan in the event that staff do choose to leave the school if it's converted to year-round because they would prefer to work on a traditional calendar? Has the district taken that into consideration?
So we've had the last 2 years, we've had some calendar conversions. 2 years ago, we converted Pleasant Grove Elementary from traditional to multi-track. And then we just converted for this current school year, Pine Hollow Middle School and Rollsville Middle School from multi-track to traditional. We don't have much data on the staff turnover just yet, but it is something we're going to continue to track. And as we have more data, we'll present that as part of this process moving forward. But what we try to do is I work with HR to make sure that we give them enough of a runway, and the school principal and area superintendent to give them enough time so that they can look at opportunities to try to plan for any particular loss in staffing. We also, we're giving this 2-year window so that staff can also have time to make the choices that work best for them. But no, we don't have a particular solution as of yet that we say like, oh, hey, we plan to have 30 teachers who don't want to teach, on the year-round calendar, they're going to move. We do have teachers who want to teach on the year-round calendar, so they'll be easily. We anticipate you'll have people who want to come work at the particular school. Plus, Oakview is a great school. It's a great place to be, great leadership. So no matter what calendar it's on, I'm sure they'll have a great experience at the school.
And I would like to note that the principal has joined us, Mr. Gaudet. So he is listening to the conversation and the questions, and we'll follow up with him as needed to support him with any questions his staff may have after today's session.
I didn't even know he was here when I said that. So.
Yeah. Let's go into some numbers. We have quite a few questions kind of challenging or asking questions about projections and so forth. So one is the projections that you looked at earlier, and I can scroll back to that slide if that would be helpful. Let me see if I can get to, I think it was this slide here. Does it consider trends with students moving to, let's say, private, charter, maybe even leaving this area and going to a magnet school within the district, or perhaps even homeschool? Do the projections take into account those types of student movements?
So the hardest thing to predict is parent choice, right? But we do have some historical data that we do use as part of this process. However, because we are a public school, we also have to make sure that we have seats available for all the residential growth in a particular area. But we have made some tweaks over time to better utilize the data we've grown through this process. Because again, our goal is to not impact as many families as possible. So we've really tried to find ways to really hone in on what do we think we know about a particular area. What I can tell you about the southwestern part of the county, a lot of the families attend their base school. They prefer to go to their base school. In some other parts of the county, that's not as much true. And so we do use that as part of our decision-making process.
And so just to reiterate, that is taken into account when developing the projections. And I'll just sort of add on, knowing the work as well as we both do, is that this is part of the reason why the forecast is done every year.
Yeah.
So that if there are changes in those trends, they can be taken into consideration for those longer range outlooks. Another piece was thinking about all of this. Has there been any feedback from families about whether or not they prefer to be reassigned versus having the calendar change? Because I believe you said the calendar change is specifically being recommended for a capacity gain. So if there are schools nearby that have some space, have parents weighed in and said whether or not they prefer just to be reassigned to a different school versus having their current school's calendar changed?
So I'll say this. So generally when we have overcrowded schools, if parents generally submit transfer requests and you're trying to come out of a cap school, we're more than happy to accommodate a lot of those. We generally don't get enough to help provide long-term support for the school. Not to mention the year-round schools in the particular areas, while they do have available seats today, that's not anticipated to be there long-term. And so staff also has to be careful that we don't overfill particular schools so that we end up capping and then turning away base students at those particular schools as that growth comes to fruition. So it's a juggling act, but as much as possible, yes, we can try to look at a parent's preference through the transfer module. But again, we have to follow policy 4150 as well when we do that.
And I'm going to read the question a little bit differently, thinking about some feedback that we've received as an agency over time, particularly in this region, when a very specific question has been asked about how should we manage enrollment growth. The southwestern area of the district has leaned a little bit over the last 2 or 3 years more toward the idea of we really love our schools. They're really amazing. We'd rather not be reassigned permanently out of our school through an enrollment plan change. And we'd prefer to have a year-round calendar so we can at least stay at our current school. That may not be the case for every single member of the community, but we have seen a shift in perspective over the last, I want to say 4 or 5 years. Since we've been really asking that very specific question through focus groups and through other types of engagement efforts. So that's just 2 different ways to attack a similar question.
Thank you for sharing that, Susan.
Mm-hmm. This, I think, falls into that same bucket. How much does the staff or does the board take into account the community's opinion about the calendar for their school when making those recommendations?
So I anticipate the board to hear loud and clear what parents and staff are saying. And that's why I also wanted to make sure that I was able to elevate the staff voice from this by separating when we share the feedback with the board. I do want to separate the staff sentiment as opposed to the parents. Not to say that it's different. I haven't really gotten to that point to analyze it yet, but I do want to make sure that they can hear loud and clear what the staff at the particular school say as opposed to the parents. I've heard parents or staff say, this is a done deal. I don't know why you're wasting our time. And that is certainly not true. I actually spoke with board members today to give them a heads up about the conversation, and they're looking forward to hearing what the staff and the parents have to say, because they want to make the best decision for the district as well. And I think what gets lost in that is, I have 3 kids, and it's very difficult to please every one of my children, but no matter what decision I make, I'm always going to do what's in best for the entire family. And I think that's kind of how the board tackles a lot of these issues. They want to do what's best for every individual school, but they also have to balance that against what's best for the district as a whole. So it's never an easy decision, but they will hear and they will consider that information.
So I think the answer to the question that I'm seeing here, which is, it feels like this decision's already made. And it sounds like the answer is no, it's not. A staff recommendation perhaps
Absolutely
is
not.
pretty solid, but the board has not weighed in on either side of this decision yet.
Yeah. And often, I've gotten questions about, well, will the board overturn a staff recommendation? And the answer is yes. And Susan knows that just as much as I do. When I used to do the assignment plans as well, we put forth recommendations all the time to the board. We provide feedback. We provide fiscal resources to show how it's impacting. And then the board has to balance all of that and make a very difficult decision. And so they have at times not gone with a staff recommendation and gone with something else that they feel is more important. And that's okay. And I think that helps me feel good about the process as a whole, because it's not always doing what staff tells you to do. It gives the opportunity for everyone to be heard during this process.
Just a quick moment. I noticed that some people maybe have just recently joined us. We're using the Q&A feature to capture your questions. So if you'll please just find that feature in your Google Meet and post your question there, and we'll capture that and add it to our growing list. We have a very active group tonight, Glenn.
Yep.
So staying in that same space, asked a little bit differently, parents are asking, what can we do to make sure that our voice is heard? So are there any other avenues than this information session for parents to make sure that their voices are being heard by the board?
The thought exchange is really great. I think by going onto the thought exchange, rating thoughts that support how you feel will really elevate those thoughts. And then that can be brought to the forefront for the board. People have said, well, I'll just contact the board members. I don't suggest you do that. I think it's very difficult for the board to answer all of those emails. And that's why they've asked us to do these sessions, so that they can get the sentiment that the public has. If there's any questions or concerns about your particular student, you can always reach out to the Office of Student Assignment and we'll help answer those questions. But just your general sentiment, that's why we capture it anonymously through the thought exchange, so we can make sure that everyone has an equal voice, and we can utilize the platform to elevate the feelings of the entire group.
Since you mentioned the thought exchange, I wanted to find that screen really quickly for anyone who might have joined late or hasn't stumbled across it in either one of their emails on our website or through other engagement activities.
Thank you.
You mentioned earlier that there are a couple of new schools that are kind of close to Oakview. I believe Woods Creek and Rex, even Pleasant Plains, perhaps. Some family members or community members are asking, couldn't we just assign those new neighborhoods that are in the Oakview subdivision, maybe the new growth, to maybe one of those schools, since you've mentioned that they're slightly under enrolled at this time?
It's a good question. And so we've looked at that when we opened those particular schools. Could we or should we add additional neighborhoods to those particular schools so that we can fill them up more? I think, the hard part is the long-term impact that would have on the area. You have other areas within that the proposed base attendance areas, or actually finalized base attendance areas, that are expecting extreme growth as well, that will fill up the schools. I think, again, stability purposes, as Susan shared earlier, we're often hearing from a lot of families, particularly on this part of the county, that they prefer to stay at their particular school. And so we were trying to honor some of that feedback as well.
So thinking about what you said about stability, we've got several comments saying that changing my track really might be as destabilizing as perhaps an assignment change. Is there any consideration for finding a way to impact the least number of families possible with these types of recommendations?
I mean, I think that's where we are today, right? We've tried to limit the impact of this change as long as possible. I think, with a recommendation that's going to be 2 years from now, considering how crowded the school is today and how crowded it'll continue to be over the next 2 years before we would implement a particular change if it's approved by the board. I think that's trying to provide stability as much as possible. It's just there's no easy solution to this. I think going back to, we don't have enough money to build all the schools we need in these particular areas and deal with the growth that's coming in other parts of the county, and to deal with the need for renovations for other schools throughout the district.
There are several questions about projected crowding, and I know you mentioned them during the presentation, so I wanted to bring this back up. There was one that was specifically asking what Oakview's projected crowding was, and I believe according to your numbers here, it's in the over 110%.
Correct.
Category. Okay. And then they're thinking about that. There are some community members and maybe even some staff members that are noticing a slight shift in the enrollment at Oakview, and they're feeling like the school's gotten a little bit smaller over the last couple of years, even though it's capped. And they're just curious, is this really even necessary moving forward based on these recent reductions in enrollment at the school?
It's a good question. As I shared earlier, we tend to see bubbles in enrollment over time. And in a particular area where you've got the high growth that's projected, we still anticipate the school's going to be overcrowded over time. And you're also looking at a school that, while they've done a really good job of utilizing all the space available at the school to accommodate the students that walk through the doors, we also have to balance from an operational efficiency standpoint, was that the intended use for the building, right? I often had spoke about, I have a Nissan Altima and I can put a tow hitch on the back, but it's not meant to tow a boat. I could probably get away with it for a short term, but long term, it'll put too much stress on the car. And that's generally what you see with schools. The more and more you utilize the facility outside of what its intended use was for, that escalates the need for a renovation sooner than it would normally need. And so therefore that becomes, one of the considerations we take when we look at these recommendations.
And I believe another element that we've talked about with several of our school-based staff is that it does, on occasion, not always, but reduce the flexibility of the school to be able to meet the different needs academically of students by having reduced access to spaces. It's not always the case, but in some cases it can also reduce the ability to bend and flex with the academic needs and the program needs of their students.
Excellent point.
We've got several questions about the staffing, and I know we answered it earlier, but since there's so many of them, let's just talk about that one more time. There seems to be a concern that there are some staff members at the school, and potentially a lot of staff members based on the phrasing in some of these questions, that really prefer the traditional calendar, and there's a sense that maybe a lot of staff might leave the school if it changes calendars. So again, I know you've already answered this once, but we are later in the session. What is the district, or what are we prepared to do to support a school if that actually were to come to fruition?
So every year we have a hiring window, right? And so staff will have the ability to transfer in and out of Oakview if they don't prefer that calendar. Just as I shared earlier, while some people prefer to not teach on the year-round calendar, we do have many teachers around the district who prefer to teach on a year-round calendar. And again, Oakview is a great school and it's a great place to work. And I'm sure that regardless of the calendar, you'll find enough people who want to come work there.
I'm going to shift gears a little bit. We've got some feeder pattern and alignment and calendar alignment questions that are popping up or have popped up throughout the session. So one is, well, we're currently assigned to a traditional middle school. So is there plans to make some sort of a middle school change if the school were to go year round? And if so, is there an idea what that might be?
It's a good question. And that's something staff has actually looked at. Right now, the base middle school for Oakview is Apex Friendship Middle School, which also has an enrollment cap. And many of the base attendance area in Apex Friendship is continuing to grow rapidly. And so, yes, we do need to look at other alternatives to address the crowding concerns there. So we anticipate that if there is a calendar change for Oakview, that we could consider a middle school change if that's possible to align calendars K-8. And so that would be something we could consider. Approximate middle school in this area on the multi-track year-round calendar that has additional space is Holly Grove Middle School. So that could be a school that we could consider as well.
I was trying to find the general map. So you were talking about sort of the middle school area here.
Yeah.
In this
region. Yeah, that big
Okay.
red area to the bottom, in the bottom left of the bottom map is Apex Friendship. And you can see it's over 110% crowded.
Okay. Again, if you're just joining us, please use the Google Meet Q&A feature to post your questions, and we're rapidly trying to work through them. It's an aside type question. It's not specific to Oakview, but there are a handful of people asking, hey, since Woods Creek is so under-enrolled, why is it not on a traditional calendar?
It's a great question. And if anyone was plugged in during the enrollment plan when we opened the school, we showed slides that projected the crowding that's going to be happening at that school over time. There are several large neighborhoods that are currently within the base attendance area of that school that are projected to come online in the next several years. And so we expect some high growth happening in a short period of time. And so we didn't want to overfill the school with current students because we knew that many new students would be coming.
And let's flip the script. So let's say this moves forward. Oakview becomes a multi-track year-round school. Will families have access to any traditional options? They're recognizing that in this area, there are a lot of multi-track year-round elementary schools, and most of the traditional schools are either at or over capacity. So would there be a traditional option for some of these families?
There'll be very limited seats, to be honest. I mean, as you shared, we have crowding concerns in the Apex Holly Springs area, and the year-round, even some of the year-round schools are overcrowded. And so we have legitimate crowding concerns long-term. So availability of traditional calendars in the proximate area, they'll be very limited. I can offer families to consider magnet schools because we do have available seats at magnet schools. Many of them, if not all, are on the traditional calendar. While they may not be as proximate, they do offer the calendar that they prefer. So that could be a consideration as well.
There's a bit of a market share, if you will, concern, and we might need to define that term. But what if changing this to multi-track does create some sort of a change in sentiment about the school, and a lot of families choose to maybe, let's say, leave the district? Has the district considered that?
Always. And like I said earlier, predicting parent actions is really difficult, but we have to make decisions based on the information we have today. If parents choose to look at other options outside of the district, they have that ability. But I can speak and say that we are the best option. Oakview is a great school, and regardless of the calendar, they'll be successful.
Okay. Someone is remembering a time period from earlier in our high growth phase in the 07-08 school year. The district was faced with needing to gain vast amounts of capacity, particularly at the elementary level, very rapidly with limited bond funding. And so many elementary schools were converted to multi-track year-round that year. And at that time, families were able to, I believe the phrase was opt out of those year-round schools and have a traditional option. Is that something that's still in play today?
That's a great question. And if we had that ability, we'd offer it up. As you see on the map, any proximate schools on traditional calendar, we just don't have seats there as well. I think as we continue to grow, the number of students moving to these particular areas is quickly outpacing the number of available seats we have. A lot of that is due to the K-3 class size legislation. When we converted schools, when the class size legislation came into effect, we lost over 9,000 seats as a district across the entire district. That's equivalent of basically 13 elementary schools completely disappearing. And so that space has really hindered the district with being able to provide proximate schools. It has accelerated our need to use multi-track because we get roughly about another 200 students in an elementary school by utilizing the multi-track, which prevents us from building new schools. So those are really the areas. So we don't have the opt-out ability because we just don't have the available seats because K-3 class size legislation and the rapid growth.
We've sort of hinted around at this question a couple of times, and I think you even addressed it in the presentation. But again, recognizing that right now, it seems as if the residential development in the Oakview base is stabilized, and it seems as if enrollment is getting a little bit smaller at the school. Is there a way to maybe delay this decision for a couple of years and reassess the data to determine whether or not it's needed to go multi-track?
That's a great question, and that's something the board will consider. If that's part of the feedback that parents would like the board to look into, please make sure that you share that in the thought exchange. Staff continues to use our annual forecast, our working knowledge of the schools in the areas. We've just come to this conclusion because we don't have any other options. Like I said, we have growth in this particular area. We don't have the capacity to continue down the current path without impacting more students than necessary.
And then I don't know that there's an answer to this question, but let's say it goes multi-track and over time it doesn't need all of that capacity. Something happens, the enrollment levels off or it drops. Would the school go back to traditional?
That's certainly a great question, and that's something we would definitely consider. We've seen that in other schools throughout the district. I would say, though, for at least the next 3 years, it would remain. When we make a calendar change, we always try to give a 3-year window, right, at the very least, and then we'll continue to monitor the data after that point. Knowing what I know about the area and the growth and how popular the schools are in this particular part of the county, I don't anticipate it switching back, if it gets approved, switching back quickly. But it is something ultimately that we would look at over time because operating on a multi-track year-round calendar does cost us more money as a district, but those costs that we provide the school with the extra months of employment to run 12 months that we don't get from the state allotment, that is offset by the ability, the $120, $130 million it costs us to build a brand new elementary school these days.
We've addressed these questions more about how much feedback actually from the public and from the community impacts it. So asked slightly differently, has any group ever successfully changed the mindset of the board or convinced the board to go against a staff recommendation, or is this just a formality?
Yep. So in our recent assignment plan, we had proposed Bowling Road Elementary to open as a multi-track year-round calendar, and the board ultimately changed that to open it as a traditional calendar. I can remember back to my days when I was in Susan's role, bringing student assignment plans to the board. I know I had proposed some changes for Abbott's Creek students to go to Durant Road, and the board ultimately overturned some of those recommendations. So yes, there have been recent opportunities for the public to provide input to the board that would overturn a staff recommendation. So yes.
This is a technical question that I honestly don't think you can answer because it's based on enrollment, but how many teachers would there be per track, per grade? Is that something that's knowable now?
Yeah. So again, all of that is based on the enrollment at the time of the school. But generally, we could probably anticipate, knowing the size of the school, you're maybe looking at maybe no more than 2 classes per track on every grade level, I would say. We call that double loaded. That's kind of where I would anticipate looking at the numbers. But again, that's something that our staff would work with the school staff to determine what's the best way to utilize the facility.
So would it be accurate to say that at least 1 teacher per grade per track, so 4 per grade, and potentially as many as 6 or 8, depending on how many of those tracks are double tracked?
Thank you for clarifying. Yes.
Okay. So, all right. We've asked this a couple of different ways, but if Oakview's calendar is changed, would they have a different middle school assignment so that they could have that K-8 calendar continuity?
So that's something we would consider if the board does want to move forward with this. And while, again, we have 2 years to address this concern, because, again, these changes wouldn't take place until 27, 28. That would be something that we would then do some outreach with the public and then determine, is that something that we want to accommodate in a future assignment plan?
I'm not sure if you included any academic research in this presentation, but there's some questions about the academic benefits or maybe not benefits of being multi-track versus traditional. They're being asked in several different ways. One saying, hey, it doesn't sound like it's actually that important for students in our community. It might be better for students in a different community. Is there any research that the district is using to determine the academic impacts of a calendar change?
Great point. And so you'll often hear proponents of multi-track say, well, it lessens learning loss. And that's not particularly the case, because our multi-track year-round schools kids don't go to school more days. So it doesn't really alleviate learning loss. However, year-round schools, actually, Susan, can you ask that question one more time just to make sure that I hit the point?
Yeah, it was just what types of research are being used by the district to support things like the use of multi-track year-round from an academic perspective.
Okay, so we've got the learning loss, and then also in the April presentation that I made to the board, you can go back and look at that. We'll make sure we'll post it as well. We worked with Elon University and Katie Rouse, who's a professor over there, and she's done extensive work on the year-round calendar, and she presented information that talked about the type of calendar does not impact the achievement at a school. And so the board feels comfortable in making calendar changes, moving from traditional to multi-track or multi-track to traditional, knowing full well that it's not going to negatively impact the student achievement at a school. And that is a study that has been based on Wake County students. So it's good information and it's relevant data.
And it does look like the website's been updated. So both of the links to both of those studies that you talked about are posted in the Q&A portion of the calendar conversion website.
Okay. And if we can work with staff to get the April presentation by Dr. Rouse, that would be great as well.
Sure. What about continuing to use the cap and just capping students out who are moving into the area new and maybe capping them out to a year-round school, or letting Oakview stay as is and just have the new students go to a different school?
And I appreciate that question, because that's something that, ultimately we would have wanted to do, right? Try to not impact families as much as possible. I don't know if you heard earlier when I talked about the national bus driver shortage and the impact it's having on our transportation system. And so it's just, when you cap a school, it's an inefficient way to deal with the crowding at a school, because the students that are getting capped out don't always live in one neighborhood. So it's not easy for a bus to just go in and grab those kids and then leave and go to a neighboring school. It also allows for longer bus rides and inefficient bus rides or unreliable bus rides, because it's just so inefficient on our system. And so that's why the board has asked us to reduce the number of capped schools over time. But that has been a solution we've used for many years. It's unfortunately we just don't have the resources to continue using it at this time.
Thank you for that. There's some comments about how Oakview has managed its crowding over the last several years, and how on a couple of occasions they might have used a co-teaching model to help make sure class size ratios were met without having to expand classroom spaces. And that, again, I'm still seeing sentiments that right now we're not quite that crowded. So why could we not use these other methods and stay on traditional versus needing the calendar conversion?
And I kind of touched on that earlier when I talked about the intended use of the building. It's very difficult when you're continuing to put a larger number of students than the building was intended to use at a time. And so that escalates the need for life cycle projects, maintenance and operation projects. And therefore, it's not something long-term that we want to continue to do. While I commend the principal for dealing with the crowding in very unique ways, and he's doing a great job. It's just not something that we feel that we can continue to do long-term and sustain the building.
And I know I don't think the specific question has come up, but you made a mention of this early on. When we say staff is making a recommendation,
good point.
Which part of district staff are making the recommendation?
That's correct. And I tried to mention that earlier.
Yeah, you did.
When I say staff, we talk about the Office of School Choice staff are making this recommendation. And I will be very clear as much as possible. So thank you for bringing that to my attention as well. And when we do talk to the board, we will make sure that we outline Oakview staff says X, Y, and Z. School choice staff says X, Y, and Z.
Someone had a unique sort of perspective. They've had some experience being at a multi-track year-round school that is overcrowded and perhaps capped. What happens if that becomes an issue for Oakview? So we go ahead and move forward, we make it multi-track, and then it continues to fill and yet gets back to an overcrowded or overfull state. What then?
It's a great question. And that's where we'll have to continue to lean on the other levers that we have to deal with the long-term crowding concerns. You've got building new schools, which, that ultimately, if you've got a lot of year-round schools in a particular area and they're all overcrowded and capped, and there's no other way to reassign students to proximate schools, it forces the district to have to build a new school in that area. So we would probably try to look at adding a project like that to the CIP.
I'm trying to find some new questions. Very specific question, and I know you definitely want to address this one. If a switch is made to year-round, how would we support students that are maybe being served with special needs programming, an IEP, a 504, that taking weeks off at a time can sometimes make those transitions difficult for students to come back into the building? It's hard enough keeping consistent staff in those classrooms. Now changing the calendar and the routine could be very difficult for these students. Is there any consideration for that?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And it's something that, we tackle because not every school calendar works for every child, right? So that's where we do have the hardship transfer period for families. And that's generally late February, maybe early March, where families can submit transfer requests to other schools. And if it's denied by staff during that window, the family will get an appeal, and then that appeal may be heard by the Board of Ed. And so therefore, you can share all the details of your particular situation for them to make that decision. But that is something that they can consider.
A budget question. What are the budget implications with the school becoming year-round, particularly thinking about what we're hearing in the news about budget cuts? Is this going to be more expensive, and can the district afford it?
That's a good question. So yes and yes, right? It's going to be more expensive than operating it on the traditional calendar because, like I said earlier, you've got additional months of employment that we need to provide to school staff in order to operate, on a 12-month calendar, because you'll have maybe your lead secretary, some other people within the building, the AP. Those people will now go from 10 months to 12 months. So it does cost additional money there. However, when you balance that against the long-term cost for the district, that I don't have to build $120, $130 million elementary school in that particular area, that cost is savings over time. We are also looking at multiple schools on the multi-track year-round calendar to bring them to traditional calendar. So we would then use the savings from those particular positions and give them to the schools that need to expand to multi-track from traditional. So therefore, we're trying to keep our operating budget at or about where it is today, as best we can.
Staying in that space of budget, you mentioned earlier that use of the building sort of nonstop, if you will, or with the extra students really puts a lot of wear and tear on the building. Wouldn't converting it to multi-track do the same thing and renovation still be needed sooner?
It does, but I think the difference between operating a full multi-track, a full traditional calendar, and then utilizing the same number of students on multi-track, you got to remember that only 75% of the students would be in the building at the same time. So it does provide some relief in that sense when you get about 25% less students in the building at the same time, because we can stretch it out over 12 months. But you bring up a very good point. There are no good solutions to this, and that's really why we're making these difficult recommendations, because we just don't have the funding, we don't have the facilities. There's lots of things that we're struggling with, and so we're trying to find ways to solve these problems with the limited resources we have.
Slightly different perspective. Families are noticing that Oakview right now is the only capped school that's being brought up for discussion for going multi-track year round. How come none of the other traditional elementary schools or middle schools that are capped are part of this discussion this year?
Yep. So that's something that staff has looked at. We do have several other capped schools that we anticipate to either be impacted by new schools opening in the current years or the years in the next several years coming up, or they may be impacted by renovations in the CIP. So those are schools that we'll continue to look at. We're also exploring other avenues to deal with the long-term crowding concerns in those particular areas. So that is something that is on our radar and we're continuing to address. But for this particular school year, for 27-28, we've only looked at 3 schools to try to address whether it's overcrowding at a traditional calendar school or underutilization at multi-track.
We actually do have a comment that says they think this sounds amazing and they're sure that a lot of thought went behind it and that you're still trying to work through the logistics. But the question is, would this be permanent from 27-28, or would it just revert back to traditional at some future time?
Good question. So when we make a recommendation to convert a school's calendar, we will keep that school calendar for at least 3 years, and then we'll continue to review the data over time. So I would never say anything's permanent. I've been here long enough to know that schools can change calendars and things change all the time. But we'll always use the data to drive the decision-making process. So if we don't need multi-track year-round, we will consider converting it to traditional, because as I shared earlier, operating on a multi-track year-round calendar does cost the district more in our operating budget. However, it does save the long-term need to build additional schools. So our goal would be to have it on traditional calendar long-term.
So I want to reiterate, we've received a lot of questions that are very similar to ones we've already addressed. What would be our traditional option? What would be our middle school calendar alignment? What about the current students? Or do you realize that you're restricting the total number of traditional schools? So I know we've answered all of those, and I just want to make sure people are knowing that we're seeing that there's multiple different iterations of those same questions coming through. And anything that we may potentially miss, we will definitely address with the FAQ on the website. But I want to get into a whole new genre of questions, which is kind of gets to the, okay, so let's say this happens as a family, how do we know who gets priority for track choice?
That's a good question. So we have guidelines that we share with the principal about how to create track assignments. One of the steps is we do ask for preferences. Right, we'll ask all the families, what tracks do you prefer? Rank them in order. And so the principal can use that to make the track placements, because the principals ultimately make the track placements at a school. There's lots of different things they need to balance. Support services for particular students. You don't want to overload certain tracks with too many students who need additional supports. You want to make sure your tracks are balanced. You don't want to have too many females in a particular class or a track as opposed to males. There's a whole slew of other things that they'll look at, IEP needs, special ed needs that are not, in a regional program. And so they balance that against, the teachers that they have in the room, because you're also trying to place students with teachers that, you're going to get the best out of all the students as well. So there's lots of things that a principal has to consider when they make those track placements. But to ultimately answer the question, we do first ask for parent preference, and then we try to accommodate that as much as possible.
Um, I'm going to get to some teacher or staff comments. It looks like we've got several staff members on the call. This is just a sort of off to somewhere else. I think someone's noticing some of the things you shared about crowding throughout the district. I believe there was a series of maps that showed crowding across the district. And I think it brought to mind, someone asked, are schools in the Zebulon or Wendell area being considered for multi-track?
It's a great question. Yes. So, as we have limited number of schools in that area. And I'll admit, when I first started working here 20 years ago, I never thought we would build as many schools or have crowding concerns in the Wendell Zebulon area that we're expected to have. And so when you look at the capital improvement plan, we have a couple new schools coming to Eastern Wake. And all of the new schools right now that we recommend opening moving forward, we're going to recommend them open on the multi-track year-round calendar. We just converted Lake Myra from a track 4 only to multi-track for this for next year, for 26-27. And we are going to continue to have to look at the crowding concerns in the area long-term because they have explosive growth coming and we can't build enough schools fast enough. So we'll have to continue to utilize multi-track in that area as well.
Right. And then just in that sort of off, non sequitur type thought, we had someone asking, has the county looked at splitting itself into smaller or mini districts, just knowing how large we are? In case everyone on the call doesn't realize, we have 203 schools operating this year. We cover the entirety of Wake County, all of the public schools in Wake County. And so they were saying, should we have like a Northwest Wake or a Northeast Wake or Southwest or something like that? Has the district even considered sort of breaking off into smaller pieces?
I'm not aware of any of those discussions, but I will say if you break off into certain groups or regional groups, you're going to run into problems because it will be more costly, right? Because you'll need more staff in those particular areas where you have staff now that work for all schools. You'll have to have staff specifically for those regions. So you may not have the ability to provide the same level of service and or staff the appropriate amount of people to run a district if you broke it up into smaller groups. So I'm not sure it would be cost effective at this time, but I'm not aware of any discussions that are being had about that.
Okay. And then I'm going to ask just one final question on when is the board going to make this decision? How can parents continue to share information with the board, especially those that maybe are opposed to this or perhaps are in favor of it, either way? What can they do? And then I really want to get into a handful of staff questions, but I do think you're going to have a separate meeting with staff, but there are several staff members here, so I want to acknowledge some of the questions they brought forward.
Yep. So thought exchange is the best way to get your information out for the board to consider. Get your thoughts up there, rate thoughts that are in line with, what you think and feel. That is the best way for the board to hear what you have to say, because we will be presenting that information to the board, anticipating it coming to the board on September 16th, I believe is the date. So that's our goal right now. I do once, because it is summertime, right? And the staff aren't in the building. So I have talked to the principal and we're trying to figure out a day and time for us to come talk to staff when they come back into the building for the next school year, so that I have an opportunity to talk with staff, answer any individual questions they may have. And then I wanted to do that prior to bringing it to the board. So that's why we waited until September 16th so that we had time to meet with the board. And I anticipate we may even have another virtual public session based on the information I'm hearing from board members. So we may be able to have another one of these sessions to answer additional questions that may come up between now and that time.
I'm not sure, I cannot tell honestly if this is a parent or a staff member question, but just recognizing and appreciating diversity that's going on and the ongoing conversations, particularly Oakview. Obviously, this is a session for that school. Is there any consideration or any information you can share about how demographics have been considered in the conversation and the recommendations, and how is that taken into consideration when assigning tracks for students to make sure that students aren't being separated from each other or anything along those lines?
So we didn't make any, we didn't study demographics for this particular school when determining whether we're going to use multi-track or traditional, right? We're looking at the student body as a whole saying, hey, this school's overcrowded and we're going to operate, more efficiently. But that does come into play when you start looking at track assignments, and that is something hopefully the principals look at when they assign their tracks, is that you're balancing your tracks socioeconomically, racially, through gender. You ideally want to have balanced tracks across all of your grades.
Some staff members are talking about the idea that, if I've always taught on traditional, and some seem to be speaking from experience and from seeing friends maybe who've made these transitions, that switching to year round doesn't always go well, that perhaps it actually increases a sense of burnout. And so I just want to make sure that they hear that we're capturing this. And I think if you want to talk at all about how you're planning to use questions that are already being captured by staff, and just kind of address staff related questions, because I know we can't, some of them due to HR reasons we couldn't necessarily talk about today, but we certainly have plans for that. So I just thought you might want to talk about that.
Yeah. So staff, they should have access to a Google Doc where they can input some of their questions, and I can use that to address some of them when I come speak to the staff at a later date. I can work with the principal to make sure we send that out one more time. But just as a reminder, when we do present information to the board, I'm going to separate out the staff sentiment and then also share the parent guardian feedback, so that the board can see the differences, if there are any, in the feedback that each group is sharing.
There's some that feel like perhaps there's a disconnect between central office recommendations and what's actually happening, on site with the schools. And so I just want to lift up that concern that, we have someone that says, as a former teacher, it's kind of hard to hear what's being said as if, this is good for staff. So just something to keep in mind. And I just want to lift up that thought.
Yeah, and just to add to that, this is not a recommendation that we come lightly. Like we understand that this is impacting families and staff. We just, like I shared earlier, we just don't have the resources to continue to run the way that we're running our business. And so we need to utilize all of the seats available that we have, because we just can't afford to continue to build and renovate the schools that we need.
All right, we're at about 7:17, and we've promised everyone we'll give them their evening back at 7:30. So I'm going to do quick answers, Glenn. I need you to do short responses.
Okay.
So one is, sounds like the real problem really is growth. Where do we go to address irresponsible growth that our system can't handle?
So we don't approve building permits. So that would be your local municipality. We have to deal with the growth that comes to us. So if you've got concerns about growth in your areas, talk to your municipal leaders.
Okay. What if the board hears all this community feedback and feels that the sentiment for changing calendars is just too strong to go along with the recommendation to go to multi-track year round? Then what? Oakview's still overcrowded. Is there a plan B?
So staff would have to look at other alternatives to address the concerns, and it's just something we'll address if we need to. Like I said, we've got building new schools in a particular area. You've got reassignments in a particular area. We've already used capping, so we'll have to look at some of those other options if the board doesn't want to make the conversion.
Okay. When a school does go year round, how does that impact things like specials, music, art, PE, since they don't really get to track out?
Yeah. So students still get to participate in all of the classes that they normally would. They just do it at different times throughout the year. So they still get to do that. You'll often see, though, let's say if this more is for a middle school thing, but you have band. That's an all-year elective where all the students come. That tends to be a little bit more difficult. So it's hard for like a band teacher to have all the band kids in the band room all year long. But at an elementary school, that's not as much of a problem. But the students will still get the same classes that they have. It's just they're in different increments throughout the year.
Again, quick question, quick answer. What about just going single track?
That is something we can consider. However, it doesn't solve the issue that we need the additional seats in the area. But that could be a solution that if we feel like, looking at the data that we don't expect this explosive growth to come as quickly, we could look at converting to track 4 with the anticipation of going to multi-track once that actual growth is actually needed when it comes. So that is something we could consider.
Middle school now, shifting mindset. Isn't there land at Woods Creek for a middle school? Because it sounds like that's going to be the next problem.
Yep. So again, you're talking about building new schools, and we talked about the cost of building new schools. And so utilizing the space in this particular area, we're trying to use multi-track. We have multi-track year-round middle schools in this area that have available seats. So we don't have the need for building a brand new middle school just yet. But that is something we could utilize at a future date.
Traditional option. How do we accommodate families that need traditional? We've talked about that several times. Do we have concern? Someone has a concern. We've got an amazing PTA. It's working really well. Wonderful school-wide events. Does the multi-track year-round impact that? And will that split and divide the families in the community?
I'm not aware of that. My children attended a multi-track year-round school. They still had PTA events that were all school-wide. And if you were tracked out and you wanted to participate, you could. Sometimes they do multiple events to make sure that all the tracks get to participate. But that's not something that I'm aware of being an issue.
Okay. I want to lift up some saying that the hardship transfers don't really solve the problem because now I have to go to a school farther away that may be less convenient and may not have transportation. So I want to lift up that concern. Wear and tear on the building throughout the summer months, especially thinking about this hot summer. There's a lot of comments about, isn't this actually going to put more stress on the building by needing to run AC all summer long while the students are tracking in and out? Is there a chance I might be teaching in a room with no AC in July? Right. Lots of comments about that. So I don't know if you have anything to say towards that, or if that's just something for us to make sure we lift up.
Yeah, we can consider, we can share that as well. I mean, I think the board understands that, operating on a multi-track year-round is harder on a building. However, we do run our ACs all year long. It's just a different, having kids in the building does run it harder during those summer months. But again, the overall cost, when you look at a life cycle project, gets accelerated when you're operating the building with too many students that it was intended to use.
Okay. There are some that are saying, and we'll have to, look at all the evidence, but some that are saying, it seems as if there's a majority that are saying, please don't change our calendar. So I do want to lift that up.
And that came out in the summary as well.
Okay. Are there any schools that are going the other way from multi-track to traditional?
Yeah, so we do have 2 schools that were in the process of doing virtual public engagement sessions. They're more to the north. So when you look at the map on the top left of the screen, you see that large area of white. We have multi-track year-round schools in that particular area that we no longer need the additional seats. So we are looking at converting from multi-track to traditional at those schools.
So that sort of general area there. Yeah. Okay. When will we know the decision?
I anticipate to bring it to the board September 16th. So that would be the earliest they could make a decision.
Concerns, is Oakview prepared to be, was it designed and built and constructed to support year-round? Will there be additional costs like carts or other types of equipment that might have to be picked up? So just lifting up a concern that will there be additional costs with converting to multi-track that maybe you hadn't addressed already with the staffing piece?
So yes, we did share earlier that there are additional costs that come to dealing with a school on a multi-track compared to traditional. So yes, we will budget for that.
A question, why are numbers like this not looked at when we do design and build our schools? Why aren't they just built bigger?
So that's a good question. Land is really difficult to come by. And so finding land large enough to fit the template that we have of a school on it at this time is very difficult and very costly. Building schools bigger, some of our municipalities don't really enjoy that either because it does come with traffic and congestion concerns in the areas. But that is something we can consider to look at, is building schools bigger if necessary.
And then also sort of tagging onto that, someone did a slightly different comment. Could we not just do some construction at Oakview site and just make it bigger?
That's a good question.
Do a rush.
Unfortunately, when we got the approval for that particular site, there were only so many kids that are permitted to be on that particular site per the town. And so we're already exceeding that. So I'm not sure we would really want to go into the business of adding on to that, because if you add an addition to the building, it's not easy like just adding on an additional bedroom at my house. There are other restrictions that are in play. You have to have enough parking, impervious surface, runoff areas. So that would expand, that would need a larger parcel for us to deal with. But that is something also that we have continued to look at. We've added trailers to the campus as well. So we're utilizing those. We're just running out of options, unfortunately.
Staff question. We're at 7:25, and I promised everyone we'll give them their time back at 7:30. So I think we're going to have to go with these last two, and then any of the questions that maybe we didn't get to or that are slightly nuanced or slightly different, we'll make sure we get addressed on the website. Just thank you all so much. I think we're at 5 or 6 pages of questions. Would siblings always be put on the same track?
Siblings, will they always be on the same track? Is that question?
Yes.
Oh.
Yes.
Yes, as much as possible. That's something that we try to accommodate.
And then if I'm a current teacher with Wake County, do I get any kind of preference for picking my track?
No, I'd have to ask previous year-round principals. I don't know how they do that, the staffing plans.
So that's a great question to bring forward to
yes, I can do that. I can bring that to
Okay.
the staff question. But I can say this: if you're a staff member and you have children, we will always put your children on the same calendar or at the same school if that's appropriate, and they will always be on the same track as well, especially if they're not at the same school.
Okay. And then one last, this is a technical one. This isn't for you. The question was, is this call being recorded?
Yes.
And the answer is yes. Will it be posted? The answer is yes. And so that's going to take us to the end of our questions for today. If you have any last few questions in these last 2 or 3 minutes, stick them in the Q&A feature. We'll grab them. We'll look at them. Staff will go through them and make sure that we have them addressed. I know we've had questions in previous sessions. Do you sort of filter the questions? We really don't. We just try to figure out which ones are all asking the sort of same thing and post those. So,
and staff questions, if they could put them in the Google Doc as well, that would be great. We'll work to answer those.
Great. And if you don't know what that is, just ask the principal. He's got it for you. And then I think I'm going to turn it back over. Well, actually, I'll just say in closing, because you've talked a lot. So thank you all so much for joining us. And thank you, Glenn, for sharing all of the information that you have and sort of taking all those on the spot, on the fly questions, especially when I put you on the rapid round. We are just so appreciative that you've given us this time and that you've really shared your true and honest and genuine feedback with us. Continue to do that, please, in the thought exchange. Your next steps, as Glenn mentioned earlier, is that at this point, we're finishing out the ongoing thought exchange. It'll remain open through early September. The reason is recognizing this is a traditional school. We might, need some families to kind of get back from summer vacations and things like that. So we're not rushing that part of it. You'll have that thought exchange through September 5th. This recording will be posted and put on the website so that you can review that. And we are at this point anticipating taking recommendations to the board on September 16th. As a reminder, the thought exchange is open. We've said that 100 times. This calendar conversion website is going to be your one-stop shop for resources, for links, for anything that was shared here tonight, as well as updated FAQs as we go through the process. And as Glenn mentioned, we'll put some direct links to some of those prior presentations so that you can make sure you can access those if you were interested in seeing that material. We again just thank you so much for joining us tonight. We hope this session was informative. It was a good use of your time and that you were able to get most of your questions answered. Your input and feedback is so vital to this process. Again, thank you, and we hope you enjoy the remainder of your evening.
Thank you for joining us.